In this video, I'm going to show you how to do a forward kinematic setup on a robot, which is going to make it a lot easier to animate. So let's start by opening up our work cell. You can either open up your existing 3ds Max animation file, or you can re-import the Inventor file, whichever you prefer. So I'm going to re-import this and I get the import screen. So I'm just going to accept the defaults here. So now we have our work cell up. What I'm going to do is hide everything except for the robot to make it easier to work with. So I'm going to select the objects, right click, and hit hide selection to hide everything. So now that we have just our robot, what I'm going to do is set up the viewport so it's easier to see everything. You'll notice in the wireframe mode all the pieces are white. So what I'm going to do is change each of these to a different color so they're easier to differentiate. So over in the Create tab under Name and Color, there's a little box that has a color. So after we've selected our object, we can click that box and change it to whatever color you'd like. So now that that's all done, I'm going to go into the Hierarchy tab and we're going to start doing our forward kinematic setup. So first, make sure Pivot's selected, and then we're going to select the lower arm and work with that first. Now what we're going to be doing is readjusting the pivot point of each object so that it's centered at the place where we want the object to pivot around, and that way it'll look natural. Now what we're going to do is select Effect Pivot Only in the Hierarchy tab. What that's going to do is allow us to move just the pivot without moving our object. You'll notice the pivot point isn't exactly where we want it, so we're going to need to move it. Now when doing forward kinematics, it's really important that we work in the local coordinate system, and I'll explain why in a little bit. Over in the Hierarchy tab, there's an option called Center to Object. What that's going to do is move our pivot to the center of our object, which is going to give us a good place to start when we reposition it. So we see after we selected that, the pivot point moves to the center of our object. So now what we're going to do is maximize the screen so we can get a better look, and then click the Move command, and then move this down to the lower pivot point where we want this arm to pivot around. Again, make sure you're working in the local coordinate system. Again, we don't have to be too precise here, just as long as we get the desired effect. So once we have this about where we want it, we can check to see if it's in a good position. So let's deselect Effect Pivot Only, and we're going to actually rotate the whole arm to see what it looks like. So click the Rotate command, and then we can rotate it about the proper axis and check to make sure it's rotating properly. So when we're checking these, it's really important to return the object to its original position so we can keep working. So always use the Undo command or Ctrl-Z to return the object. So now what we're going to do is restrict all other motion except this rotation. We're going to do this by using the Link Info tab inside Hierarchy. Now this is the part where it's really important that we're in the local coordinate system, because that's never going to change when we start moving our robot all over the place. So you notice from our triad here that we're going to want this piece to rotate just about the x-axis. So let's go over to the Link Info, and we're going to lock everything except rotation about the x-axis. You'll notice when we try to rotate this, all the other axes have disappeared. So now no matter what we do, we can only rotate about the object's own x-axis. This will help prevent mistakes later when we animate. So next we're going to do the exact same thing with the upper arm. So select the arm, select Center to Object, and then reposition the pivot point. It's where we want this to rotate about. So once that's positioned, let's go to Link Info again and link everything except the rotation about the x-axis. You'll notice that when we check the boxes under Move, the arrows that let us move the object started to disappear. So now we can check again that this part swivels like it should, and then return the object to its original position. And then we're going to do the exact same thing to this next piece. So if we happen to be in the view coordinate system when we lock all of our motion, what's going to happen is that when we rotate our robot, our axes are no longer going to line up between the local and the view coordinate systems, so the results will be unpredictable. So when we use the local system, it doesn't matter what position the robot's in because we can control its motion relative to its current position. So next what we're going to do is move on to the base here. And we'll notice that the pivot point actually looks pretty good, so we won't have to do a lot of work here. So let's go ahead and lock this. Now we want this to move around the Z-axis this time, so lock everything except the Z. So I'm going to switch views real quick and do the same exact thing with the last piece. So this one, if we center the object, because the object's symmetric, it actually goes to where we want. So again, we don't have to do much work. So like the base, this one rotates about the Z-axis, so we can lock everything but the Z again. And next what I'm going to do is just lock this collar in place so that it can't move in any direction. So now what we're going to do is link these together so we get the proper motion. So we can use the select link command. So now what we're going to do is, starting at the front of the robot, work our way back. So let's select our first piece and we can click and drag and release our mouse over the second piece. And that'll link those two together. And then we can do the same thing, working our way back. So now there's a few last details we need to take care of before we're ready to move this thing around. So first, we need to lock the base in place. So just check every box under the link info. Now what we're going to do is there's 3 little brackets that we need to link to our arms. So you can choose which piece you want these to link to, and that'll determine what it's going to look like when they rotate. So now these pieces are going to look like they're rotating along with whichever object you link them to. So now these pieces are going to look like they're rotating along with whichever object you link them to. Now all we have to do is lock the motion for each of these in all directions. So even though we're locking the motion, they'll still move relative to the other pieces. What this is doing is making sure we can't accidentally move these pieces when we start doing our animations. So now with that done, we've completed our setup, and now we can check to make sure our robot works. So let's click the rotate. Again, make sure we're in the local coordinate system and we haven't changed. And then now what we can do is rotate each of these individually, and you'll notice that the others follow along properly. If something doesn't move properly, you can check both the links and your link info where you lock the rotations to see if the problem can be fixed. So now what we can do is we can right click and hit unhide all, and that puts our robot back in our work cell and we're ready to animate.